On April 14, 1912, at 11:40 p.m., an iceberg tore open 6 of Titanic's 16 watertight compartments. She was engineered to survive only 4. That 2-compartment overshoot turned a supposedly unsinkable dream into a mass grave for over 500 people. Now, we'll dissect the collision and trace the flooding over the bulkheads to show exactly why the unsinkable ship was doomed before the last lifeboat left. 4 days before the collision, the armed Titanic had left the port of Southampton on her maiden voyage, a floating monument to ambition, luxury, and human confidence. She was the largest moving object ever built by human hands, nearly 3 football fields long, with a hull of steel and interiors of carved oak, crystal, and silk. At 82 feet 9 inches long and 46,38 gross registered tons, she eclipsed every previous ship, and her 4 towering funnels, one of which was purely decorative, gave her a profile that was instantly recognizable. The White Star Line and her builders in Belfast had produced a vessel that seemed to belong to the future, and the press had already begun to speak of her in terms reserved for natural wonders. Newspapers called her the Wonder Ship and the last word in luxury, and her builders issued a detailed booklet that emphasized her watertight subdivision. The phrase, practically unsinkable, had circled the world, and in the minds of many, the word practically had long since fallen away. The Shipbuilder magazine famously described the Olympic and Titanic as practically unsinkable, and that phrase became a marketing slogan as much as a technical claim. But to understand how that phrase took hold, we have to go back to the fierce commercial battle for the North Atlantic passenger trade. In the first decade of the 20th century, the British shipping lines were locked in a contest for speed, size, and prestige. Cunard had launched the Lusitania and Mauretania, greyhounds of the sea that had captured the blue riband for the fastest westbound crossing. The White Star Line, under the financial control of the American financier J.P. Morgan's International Mercantile Marine, chose a different path. Instead of trying to beat Cunard at pure speed, White Star decided to build ships that were slightly slower but vastly larger and more luxurious. The Olympic-class Titanic and her 2 sisters would be the largest moving objects ever built, and their interiors would rival the finest hotels on land. The Olympic and Titanic each cost about $7.5 million, roughly $200 million today, and their construction at Harland & Wolff employed over 15,000 men at the Belfast shipyard. The building of the 2 ships proceeded side by side on massive gantries, and the White Star Line placed an order for a 3rd sister, Britannic, before either had even sailed. The strategy was simple: attract the wealthy with unmatched comfort and carry the masses in 3rd class with a level of space and sanitation that no other steamship company offered. The result was a ship that seemed to redefine what was possible, and the public, hungry for symbols of progress, embraced the idea that Titanic was not just a ship but a statement of human mastery over the ocean. That mastery, however, rested on a set of engineering assumptions that had never been tested under the conditions they would face on a moonless April night. But what exactly made Titanic seem unsinkable? Her safety design rested on a series of 16 watertight compartments formed by transverse bulkheads along the lower part of the hull. The bulkheads rose only as high as E-deck, about 11 feet above the waterline, and they were pierced by watertight doors that could be closed from the bridge. The ship also had a double bottom that ran for most of its length, but the sides were not double-hulled above the turn of the bilge. This meant that a side impact could open compartments directly to the sea without any inner skin to stop the water. In theory, if the ship suffered damage, only the compartments directly breached would flood, and the ship would remain afloat because the water would be contained. Titanic was designed to survive the flooding of any 2 compartments, or even any 3, and in specific scenarios, up to 4. That was an extraordinary margin for the era, and it allowed the designers to claim that the ship was her own lifeboat. But the safety system had a fatal weakness that few outside the shipyard fully understood. The bulkheads did not extend all the way to the upper decks. They were meant to prevent flooding from spreading horizontally, but if too many compartments were open to the sea, the weight of the water would drag the bow down, and once the water reached the top of one bulkhead, it could spill over into the next compartment like water flowing over the sections of an ice cube tray. The designers had calculated that the ship would remain afloat with the first 4 compartments flooded, but they had not anticipated a single continuous gash that would breach 6. Titanic's survival depended on keeping the number of flooded compartments to 4 or fewer. What happened on the night of April 14th was far beyond that. The man most responsible for turning that design into reality was Thomas Andrews, the chief designer from Harland & Wolff. Andrews was not a distant executive. He was aboard for the maiden voyage precisely to observe the ship in operation and to note any improvements for her sister ship, Britannic. Andrews was known for his meticulous work ethic. He carried a notebook everywhere and had been on board the Olympic during her trials, noting hundreds of small improvements. His knowledge was so complete that he could estimate the rate of flooding just by watching the water rise. He knew every rivet and every frame, and he had personally overseen the construction of the watertight bulkheads. On the night of the disaster, Andrews would become the first person to understand the full extent of the damage, and his calm, precise calculation would seal the fate of everyone aboard. Also aboard was Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line, a man whose presence on the bridge and in the discussions about speed would later become a subject of intense scrutiny. Ismay had been instrumental in the design decisions. Some said he had pushed for fewer lifeboats to keep the decks uncluttered, though the number actually exceeded the legal requirement. The Board of Trade rules, unchanged since 1894, required lifeboats for only 962 people based on tonnage, but Titanic carried 20 boats with a capacity of 170 knotty, still far short of the 2024 aboard. That gap was legal but lethal. But his role in the choices of that night, including whether he encouraged Captain Smith to maintain speed despite ice warnings, remains one of the most debated questions of the disaster. On April 10th, Titanic slipped away from Southampton with more than 2,000 people aboard. She called first at Cherbourg on the coast of France, and then at Queenstown in Ireland, picking up passengers and mail before turning her bow toward the open Atlantic in New York. The delay at Queenstown was longer than expected because of a coal strike in England, which had forced the White Star Line to transfer coal from other ships to fuel Titanic. Some passengers who had booked passage on other vessels were transferred to Titanic at the last minute, adding to the already crowded steerage. The passenger list read like a cross-section of the early 20th century. In first class were some of the wealthiest people on Earth, men whose names were synonymous with industry, property, and finance, traveling with their wives, children, and servants. Among them were John Jacob Astor IV, one of the richest men in the world, returning from his honeymoon with his pregnant wife Madeleine; Benjamin Guggenheim, a mining magnate traveling with his mistress; and Isidore Strauss, co-owner of Macy's department store, with his wife Ida. In second class were teachers, clergymen, professionals, and families returning to new lives, along with people like teacher Lawrence Beasley, who would later write a famous account of the sinking, and Father Thomas Biles, who would hear confessions on the sloping deck. In third class, hundreds of immigrants from Britain, Ireland, Scandinavia, Syria, and other lands carried everything they owned in trunks and bundles, bound for America and the promise of work. Among them were families like the Sages, all 11 of whom would perish, and the Asplunds, whose mother would survive but lose her husband and 3 of her 5 children. For all of them, the voyage was supposed to be a celebration of speed and comfort. Instead, it became a lesson in the limits of human engineering. The ship's first days at sea were smooth and uneventful. The weather was cold but clear, and passengers filled the public rooms, promenades, and dining saloons. The ship's public rooms included a swimming pool, a gymnasium, a squash court, a Turkish bath, and a grand staircase with a glass dome. In the first-class dining saloon, the last dinner menu on the night of the sinking included consommé, poached salmon, filet mignon, lamb with mint sauce, and Waldorf pudding. In first class, the evening meal was a formal affair with multiple courses, while in third class, families gathered in simpler surroundings. The ship's 2 bands played in different parts of the vessel, and the wireless operators handled a steady stream of messages from passengers and from other ships. The wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, worked for the Marconi Company, not the White Star Line, and their primary job was to send and receive commercial passenger messages, which generated revenue. Ice warnings were often treated as secondary. It was a routine Atlantic crossing in every respect, until the ice reports began to accumulate on Sunday. Before the ice reports, though, there was another routine that never happened. On the morning of April 14th, a lifeboat drill had been scheduled for the crew and passengers. It was canceled quietly without explanation. Some officers later said the weather was too cold, others that the captain did not want to disturb the passengers' Sunday rest. Captain Smith had presided over similar drills on other ships, but on Titanic the crew was new, the equipment untested, and the officers were still learning the ship's layout. Whatever the reason, the cancellation meant that when the moment came, most of the crew had never practiced lowering the boats, and most passengers had no idea where to go or what to do. That missing rehearsal would cost lives. Sunday, April 14th began with calm seas and a cold wind. Throughout the day, Titanic's wireless operators received a series of messages from other ships reporting ice in the shipping lanes. These were not unusual for the North Atlantic in April, but the number and detail of the warnings were striking. Ships to the west and south reported large bergs, growlers, and field ice along the route. At 9:00 a.m., the Coronia reported ice at latitude 42 Durin, longitude 49 Duro to 51 Duro. Hyder, at 1:42 p.m., the Baltic sent a message that was shown to Captain Smith, who gave it to Ismay, who reportedly kept it in his pocket. At 1:45 p.m., the America warned of 2 large bergs. At 9:40 p.m., the Mesaba sent a detailed ice warning that never reached the bridge because Phillips was handling a backlog of passenger traffic and did not mark it as important. The final warning came from the Californian at 11:00 p.m., but that too was cut off. Some messages were delivered to the bridge. Others, busy with passenger traffic and routine communications, were not treated with the urgency they deserved. The ship continued at high speed through a moonless night on a flat, glassy sea, conditions that made spotting icebergs far more difficult because there were no waves crashing against the base of the berg to make it visible. The only clues were the faint white shape of the ice itself and the sudden drop in water temperature. At 11:40 p.m., Lookout Frederick Fleet with his fellow lookout Reginald Lee, high in the crow's nest, saw a shape in the darkness directly ahead. He rang the bell 3 times and telephoned the bridge. The phone was answered by 6th Officer James Moody, who heard Fleet's words, "Iceberg right ahead." Moody relayed the message to 1st Officer William Murdoch, who was in command on the bridge at that moment. Murdoch shouted hard to starboard and ordered the engine room to stop and then reverse the engines. He also threw the switch to close the watertight doors. The officer on watch reacted instantly, ordering a turn to port and the engines reversed, but the time was too short. The Titanic was moving at roughly 22 knots, and the berg was less than a ship length away when it was first sighted. Instead of a head-on collision, the ship scraped along the starboard side of the iceberg, a grinding, shuddering impact that lasted less than 10 seconds. Many passengers later described the sensation as a curious vibration or a faint rumble, not a violent crash. Some thought the ship had dropped a propeller blade. A few wondered if they had merely touched a wave. But below the waterline, the ice had done something no one could yet see. The iceberg had not torn a single long gash. It had punched and bent the hull plates along the starboard bow, springing rivets and opening seams across a span of nearly 300 feet. The lookouts had no binoculars because the pair intended for them had been left in a locker in Southampton when 2nd Officer David Blair was removed from the crew and forgot to hand over the key. Fleet later testified that with binoculars he would have seen the berg sooner. The ice had also opened a series of narrow slits in the hull plates, some no wider than a finger, but the total area of the openings was about 12 square feet, enough to flood the ship at a rate of 7 tons per second. Seawater began to pour into the forward compartments, starting with the forepeak tank and the 3 forward holds, then into Boiler Room 6 and Boiler Room 5. Within minutes, inspectors below deck saw water rising with frightening speed. The first minutes after the collision were marked by a strange calm. Captain Smith arrived on the bridge and asked what had happened. Smith had been in his cabin and felt the vibration. He walked to the bridge in his nightclothes and asked Murdoch, "What have we struck?" "What have we struck?" Murdoch replied. "An iceberg, sir. I hard starboarded and reversed the engines, but she was too close." He ordered the engines stopped and sent for Thomas Andrews. Together they went below. Andrews saw the water in the mailroom, the flooded holds, and the rising tide in Boiler Room 6. In the mailroom, sacks of mail were already floating, and in the squash court, water was rising above the floor. Andrews saw that the forepeak tank, the 3 forward holds, and Boiler Rooms 6 and 5 were all taking water. He knew from the evidence that the damage extended across at least 6 compartments. He made a quick survey and returned to the bridge. His words were blunt. The ship had between an hour and an hour and a half left. Smith did not flinch. He ordered the lifeboats uncovered and the passengers brought on deck. But he did not order a general alarm, and many passengers remained asleep or unconcerned. The stewards went from cabin to cabin, knocking on doors and asking people to put on life belts. Some passengers refused to leave their warm beds. Others came on deck in evening dress, carrying jewelry and small valuables, still believing the ship could not sink. The boilers were shut down, and the great engines fell silent. Steam vented from the funnels with a roar that made conversation difficult. The deck began to tilt forward, so slowly at first that only the officers noticed. The flooding was concentrated in the bow, and the ship began to trim by the head. The pumps were running, but their total capacity of 1,700 tons per hour was no match for the inrush of water. The situation was beyond any emergency procedure the designers had imagined. At around midnight, Captain Smith ordered the lifeboats uncovered and the passengers brought on deck with their lifebelts on. The ship carried 3 560 lifebelts, more than enough for everyone aboard, but lifebelts only delayed death in freezing water. They did not provide a seat in a boat. The order was women and children first, but the process was slow and confused. Many passengers did not want to leave the warm, brightly lit ship for a tiny wooden boat dangling over the black water. The Titanic, despite the tilt, still seemed safer than the Atlantic. Officers were uncertain how many people each boat could hold. Many people. The lifeboats were a mix of 14 wooden boats, 2 emergency cutters, and 4 collapsible Engelhart boats with canvas sides. The total capacity was 117.8, less than half of the 224 people on board. The first boats, lowered from the forward deck, went away with far fewer than their capacity. Lifeboat 1, with room for 40 people, left with only 12. Others left with 20 or 30 when they could have carried 65. Some officers interpreted the order as women and children only, and would not allow men to board even when no more women were present. Husbands said goodbye to wives, fathers kissed their children, and then stood back on the deck to wait. The first boat launched was No. 7 on the starboard side at 12:45 a.m., with only 28 people aboard, though it could hold 65. Boat No. 6 on the port side left with 28 people, including Molly Brown, and Boat No. 1 left with just 12 people, mostly crew, while its capacity was 40. The underloading was a direct result of the crew's fear that the Davids would not hold a full boat, a fear that proved unfounded. The confusion was worsened by a lack of clear command. Chief Officer Henry Wilde had only joined the ship at Southampton, and he did not know the crew's assignments. Wilde had been moved from the Olympic at the last minute, and he was technically the senior officer, but he deferred to the captain and did not take firm control of the evacuation. Lightoller and Murdoch, working opposite sides, never coordinated their interpretation of the order, so a woman who was refused a seat on one side might find an empty place on the other. Second Officer Charles Lightoller interpreted women and children first as women and children only, and he enforced that rule strictly, lowering boats with empty seats rather than letting men aboard. First Officer William Murdoch, on the starboard side, allowed men to fill empty places if no women were waiting. That inconsistency meant that some boats left half empty while hundreds of men were told to stand back. The crew had never practiced lowering the boats, and the Davids were unfamiliar. Some boats were lowered unevenly, nearly spilling their occupants into the sea. Passengers argued, pleaded, and sometimes tried to rush the boats, but the officers held them back with pistols in a few cases. Fifth Officer Harold Lowe fired 3 warning shots into the air when a group of men tried to rush a boat, and other officers brandished revolvers to keep order. No one was shot, but the threat was real. The band assembled on the boat deck and began to play cheerful music, trying to keep panic at bay. The band members, 8 musicians under the leadership of Wallace Hartley, had been booked as separate contractors and were not technically part of the crew. They played ragtime and popular tunes first, moving to the boat deck near the entrance to the grand staircase, and they continued to play even as the deck tilted. But here, in the middle of the evacuation, there is a question that cuts through the noise. If you had been standing on that deck, with the knowledge that the ship was sinking and the number of available seats in the boats was less than half the people still aboard, what would you have done? Would you have pushed forward, held back, or followed an order you knew might cost you your life? The answers mattered, because on that night, seconds and choices separated the living from the dead. By 1:15 in the morning, the tilt of the deck was unmistakable. Water had climbed to the forward well deck, and the bow was visibly lower. The water had reached the forward well deck by 1:15, and by 1:30, it was lapping at the base of the first funnel. The angle increased from a slight incline to a noticeable slope, and passengers had to hold onto rails and handholds to move aft. The band, led by musicians who had gathered on deck, began to play ragtime tunes and waltzes, trying to keep order. Passengers streamed upward from below, climbing ladders and stairways as the water sought the lowest points. In the wireless room, the 2 operators sent out distress signals. Jack Phillips began sending the traditional CQD at 12:15 a.m., giving the position calculated by 4th Officer Joseph Boxhall, 4146 in 50D14 Woodida. At 12:45 a.m., Harold Bride suggested, "Send SOS, it's the new call, and it may be your last chance to send it." Phillips switched to SAWS, making Titanic one of the first ships to use the new international distress signal in a real emergency. Ships responded from distances, some too far, some closer, but still hours away. The closest vessel to answer, the Carpathia, was 58 miles to the southeast, and her captain ordered her to race at full speed through the same dangerous ice field. The Carpathia's wireless operator, Harold Cottam, had picked up the message almost by chance while he was off duty, and he ran to Captain Arthur Rostron's cabin. Rostron immediately ordered a course change, woke the off-duty crew, and pushed the ship to a speed of 17.5 knots far above her normal maximum through waters known to contain icebergs. But the Carpathia was still 4 hours away, and Titanic had less than 1. The other ships that answered were even farther. The Californian, only 10 miles away, did not answer because her wireless operator was asleep. The Californian's operator, Cyril Evans, had been told to shut up by Phillips and had signed off at 11:30 p.m. His set was switched off, so he never heard the distress calls that began just 10 minutes later. On the bridge of the Californian, Second Officer Herbert Stone and apprentice James Gibson watched a series of white rockets rise over the stopped ship, and Stone reported them to Captain Stanley Lord. Lord, resting in the chart room, asked if they had any colors, and when Stone said they were white, Lord did not consider them distress signals. He told Stone to keep trying to contact the ship by Morse lamp, but no one thought to wake Evans or to check the wireless. The Californian's boilers were banked, and her crew was not prepared to move. They thought the rockets were signals between ships, not distress calls, and they did not wake the captain. That failure, more than any other, has haunted the story of the Titanic, because a ship was close enough to see the rockets but not close enough to understand the silence. By 1:45, the lifeboats were being launched with greater urgency, but the remaining boats were fewer and the crowd on deck was growing. The last lifeboats were launched from the roof of the officers' quarters, and the collapsibles A and B were floated off the deck as the water reached them. Collapsible A floated away partially filled and swamped, while Collapsible B landed upside down and became a precarious refuge for about 30 men, including Second Officer Lightoller and wireless operator Harold Bride. The ship's officers fired distress rockets into the black sky, hoping for some nearby vessel. The rockets burst white, then faded, leaving only the hiss of steam and the growing noise of water. On the forward deck, the sea was now close enough to touch. The angle increased. People began to slide toward the rail. At 2:18 a.m., the lights flickered once, then went out. The Titanic broke apart, the bow section pulling away and plunging downward, while the stern rose almost vertical against the stars. For a long moment, the stern hung there. Then it too slid beneath the surface. The time was 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912. More than 1,500 people were in the water, most wearing life belts, but the water temperature was near freezing. The sea temperature was 28 difer, 2 digate below the freezing point of fresh water because of salt, and a person immersed in water that cold would lose consciousness within 15 to 30 minutes and die of hypothermia within an hour. Most of those in the water died within minutes from cold shock and cardiac arrest, not drowning. Without help, they could not survive for long. In the water, the screams of the dying rose in a terrible chorus that survivors never forgot. The lifeboats, many only half full, floated at a safe distance. Some passengers in the boats wanted to row back and rescue those in the water, but the officers in charge refused, fearing the boats would be swamped. In Boat 6, Quartermaster Robert Heischens, who had been at the wheel during the collision, refused to row back, saying, "It is our lives now, not theirs." In Boat 2, 4th Officer Boxhall also refused, and in Boat 1, the few occupants voted not to return. The inaction was not universal, but the fear of being overwhelmed was stronger than the impulse to rescue. Only one boat, under the command of 5th Officer Harold Lowe, went back. He waited until the cries had thinned to a few voices, then gathered a small crew and rowed into the darkness. His boat No. 14 had been loaded with 55 people, and he had tied several boats together to transfer passengers and free up space before returning. He found 4 men alive among the hundreds, one of whom later died. The rest had died of hypothermia, their life belts keeping them afloat, but the cold taking them one by one. The bodies of the dead, supported by life belts, remained afloat in clusters, a sight that stayed with the survivors for the rest of their lives. The sea was calm and quiet, and the stars were clear. The band had played until the very end, and as the ship went down, the musicians were swept away. Their final song, whether it was Nearer, My God, to Thee or another hymn, remains disputed, but the image of the band playing while the ship sank has become one of the enduring legends of the disaster. The Carpathia arrived at around 4 in the morning, 90 minutes after the Titanic had disappeared. She found only lifeboats scattered across a flat, empty sea. The Carpathia had reached the position calculated by Boxhall at 4,000 a.m., but it took another 2 hours to pick up all the lifeboats. The last boat, No. 12, was hoisted aboard at 8:30 a.m. Among the rescued was Bruce Ismay, who had boarded Collapsible C in the last minutes and would later face bitter criticism for surviving while so many others died. 705 people were taken aboard, wrapped in blankets, given hot drinks, and treated for shock. Many had lost husbands, wives, parents, children. The sea was filled with hundreds of bodies in life belts, but the living were the priority. As the sun rose, the full scale of the disaster became visible. The Carpathia turned her bow toward New York, carrying the survivors and the news that the unsinkable ship was gone. The Carpathia fired rockets and sounded her whistle to signal other ships, but the Californians, still stopped nearby, did not respond until her crew saw the rescue operation after dawn. Only then did Lord realize what had happened, and he ordered his ship to the scene, arriving after the Carpathia had already taken aboard the survivors. The rescue ship itself was not a luxury liner. The Carpathia was a smaller canard vessel, and her captain, Arthur Rostron, had pushed her through the ice at full speed, ordering extra lookouts and shutting off all heat and hot water to redirect steam to the engines. Rostron had posted extra lookouts in the crow's nest and on the bow, and he had ordered the ship's doctor to prepare for casualties. The Carpathia's own dining saloons and lounges were converted into dormitories and hospital wards, and the purser's office became a message center. The ship's passengers gave up their berths and clothing, and the cooks worked non-stop to produce hot soup and coffee. When the survivors came aboard, the crew and passengers gave up their cabins, their clothes, and their food. Doctors worked around the clock, and the ship's wireless operator sent out lists of names, but the system was overwhelmed. The survivors sat in shock, many unable to speak, clutching the few possessions they had carried. Some were children separated from their parents, others widows who had watched their husbands step back from the lifeboats. The Carpathia's own passengers, who had been on a Mediterranean cruise, became impromptu nurses and comforters. For 3 days, the ship steamed toward New York, and every hour brought more questions than answers. Harold Bride, though injured, helped the Carpathia's operator send survivors' names to shore, but the Marconi system was overloaded and many messages were garbled or delayed. The first partial list of survivors did not reach New York until April 17, and even then it was incomplete. The arrival in New York on the evening of April 18th at 9:30 p.m. was one of the most somber moments in the city's history. Thousands gathered in the rain at the Cunard Pier at Pier 54 on the Hudson River, waiting for word of who had lived and who had died. Wireless messages had already given the world the basic facts, but the names were still uncertain. Families stood behind barriers, hoping to see a familiar face. The survivors walked down the gangway into a storm of flashlights and reporters, many still wrapped in blankets and wearing borrowed clothes. The Carpathia first docked at the White Star Line pier to disembark the survivors, but the crowds were so large that police had to clear a path. The city had been in a state of suspense for 2 days, and extra editions of newspapers had sold out within minutes. The first to disembark were the survivors, some carried on stretchers, others walking with the help of crew. They were met by family members who had been waiting in the rain for hours, and the reunion scenes were both joyful and heartbreaking. The city that had been waiting to celebrate the arrival of the world's largest ship instead mourned its loss. Flags flew at half-mast and theaters closed. In London, services were held at St. Paul's Cathedral, and in New York, memorials were organized by the Astor and Strauss families. Press initially reported that all passengers had been saved, and the truth only emerged as the Carpathia approached New York, leading to a mix of grief and outrage. The press filled pages with speculation and accusation. The White Star Line's offices were besieged by relatives demanding answers. Lawsuits were filed within weeks, though most were settled for a fraction of the claims. Under American maritime law, the White Star Line could limit its liability to the value of the ship's remaining assets, which after the sinking were almost nil, and most claims were eventually settled out of court for small sums. The first lawsuits were filed by relatives of first-class passengers, but third-class families had little legal standing and often no documentation of their losses. The disaster shattered the public's faith in the unsinkable ship, and the phrase became a bitter irony. The loss of so many prominent first-class passengers, John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Straus, made headlines, but the loss of hundreds of third-class immigrants, many of whose names were never recorded, revealed the stark inequalities of the era. The inquiry that followed would expose not only the technical failures, but the social assumptions that had allowed a ship to sail with lifeboats for only a third of its passengers. The inquiries began within days. In the United States, a Senate investigation called survivors and crew to testify. The U.S. Senate inquiry was led by Senator William Alden Smith, who had no maritime experience but was determined to get answers. He subpoenaed Bruce Ismay and the surviving crew before they could leave the country, and his hearings produced over 1,000 pages of testimony. In Britain, the Board of Trade launched its own formal inquiry. The British inquiry, chaired by Lord Mersey, began in May 1912 and lasted 36 days, questioning nearly 100 witnesses. The testimony revealed a cascade of decisions, oversights, and assumptions that had turned a collision into a catastrophe. The investigations produced a long list of recommendations that changed maritime safety forever. The most immediate was the requirement that every ship carry enough lifeboats for every person aboard. The old rules, based on tonnage, had allowed Titanic to sail with boats for only about 1/3 of her passengers and crew. That was never allowed again. The inquiries also led to the creation of the International Ice Patrol, an organization that still monitors iceberg dangers in the North Atlantic. Wireless rooms were required to be manned 24 hours a day, so distress calls could never go unheard. The disaster also changed the way ships were designed, with stronger bulkhead standards and better evacuation procedures. But no regulation could bring back the dead. The British inquiry specifically criticized Captain Smith for ignoring ice warnings and Bruce Ismay for his presence on the bridge, but it stopped short of criminal charges. The U.S. Senate report called the disaster the result of overconfidence and neglect and placed blame on the Board of Trade's outdated regulations as much as on the individuals. Those recommendations became law in the first International Convention for Safety of Life at Sea, convened in London in 1914. The convention was signed by 13 nations and came into force after World War I, but many of its provisions had already been adopted voluntarily. The International Ice Patrol was established in 1914 and began operations by having ships patrol the Grand Banks to report iceberg positions. The U.S. Coast Guard later took over the patrol, and it continues today using aircraft and satellites. The convention mandated lifeboat drills, proper lookout watches, and round-the-clock wireless. It also required ships to have watertight bulkheads that extended higher and to carry enough life jackets for everyone. The convention also required that all ships carry a minimum number of lifeboats based on the number of people aboard, not tonnage, and that lifeboat drills be held within 24 hours of sailing. It also standardized distress signals and required wireless watches to be maintained on all passenger ships. The Titanic disaster, in other words, became the catalyst for a global system of maritime safety that still governs the seas today. Yet the changes came too late for the 1,500 people who died that night. The wreck lay undiscovered for 73 years, a silent tomb on the ocean floor. For decades, the wreck of the Titanic lay undisturbed at the bottom of the North Atlantic, 2.5 miles below the surface. The exact location was kept secret for some time to protect the site from looting, and Ballard deliberately left a plaque asking that the wreck be left undisturbed. In 1985, a joint Franco-American expedition led by Jean-Louis Michel and Robert Ballard finally located the ship. The first expedition used the deep-sea submersible Argo to photograph the debris field, and later visits revealed that the stern section had imploded on the way down, while the bow had glided to the bottom relatively intact. The discovery revealed a world frozen in time, the bow still recognizable, the stern a tangled ruin, and debris scattered across the ocean floor. The images of empty lifeboat davits and the ghostly remains of the Grand Staircase brought the story back into the public imagination. The Titanic became more than a shipwreck. It became a symbol of human pride and human vulnerability, a reminder that even the greatest machines are subject to the forces of nature and the errors of judgment. The wreck is now protected under international agreements, and while artifacts have been recovered and displayed, the site itself is considered a grave for the more than 500 people who perished. The legacy of the Titanic is not only in the safety regulations that followed or the wreck that still rests on the ocean floor. It lives in the choices made by ordinary people under extraordinary pressure. It lives in the operator who stayed his wireless key, in the crew members who kept the lights on until the final moment, in the mothers who put their children into lifeboats and then stepped back, and in the passengers who gave up their seats for strangers. Those choices, repeated thousands of times, determined who survived and who did not. The story of the Titanic has been kept alive not only by historians but by survivors' organizations, memorial societies, and families who pass down memories. The last living survivor, Milvina Dean, who was 9 weeks old at the time, died in 2009, closing the direct link to the event, but the story continues to resonate because it touches on timeless themes, hubris, sacrifice, class, and the fragility of life. The disaster also left a cultural legacy that has never faded. Books, films, documentaries, and exhibitions have retold the story for every generation. The 1997 film Titanic brought the human drama to a new audience, and the discovery of the wreck triggered debates about whether the site should be treated as a grave or as a museum. Artifacts recovered from the debris field have been displayed around the world, and each object, a shoe, a pocket watch, a set of china, speaks to the individual lives lost. The Titanic has become a lens through which we examine our own relationship with technology, with risk, and with each other. The disaster has also raised complex ethical questions about underwater archaeology, memorialization, and the commercial exploitation of tragedy. The auction of artifacts, the creation of replicas, and even tourist visits to the wreck have sparked debate, but they also keep the memory alive in public consciousness. And that brings us to the question that remains open more than a century later. Which single decision on the night of April 14, 1912 do you think most contributed to the high death toll, and why? Was it the speed through the ice field, the lack of binoculars for the lookouts, the insufficient number of lifeboats, the half-empty launches, the delayed distress rockets, or the belief that the ship could not sink? Every factor mattered, but one may stand out to you as the hinge on which the whole night turned. Let us know your answer and your reasoning in the comments below. If this documentary gave you a clearer picture of the Titanic disaster, please give it a like. It helps more people find the story. Share it with someone who thinks they already know everything about the Titanic, and start a conversation about the choices that still haunt us. If you want to explore the moments when human ambition met the limits of the natural world, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Next time, we'll follow another story of engineering triumph and human tragedy, where a single miscalculation changed history and ordinary people faced impossible choices. Until then, you can find the full playlist of our historical investigations on the channel page, and remember, the sea keeps its secrets until we are ready to listen.